e te iwi and welcome to Playmakers. Ko Ravinder Hunia tōku ingoa, and joining me today from the other side of the Tasman is SEN Broadcaster Katie Brown. Kia ora, Katie.
Kia ora, how are you?
Very well, thank you. How are you in Australia? We don't usually have a lot of talk with people in other countries.
Yeah, we're doing all right. And I think we're possibly doing a little better in lockdown. Our lockdown laws aren't as strict as over there in New Zealand. So I'm close to a beach. So I'm very grateful.
Well, we are very jealous. And as we spoke about off camera, we'll continue to drink our Moccona coffee until we can get out and about.
I'll make sure I keep this out short.
How dare you? Okay. The reason we have you here today, Katie, is to talk about the NRLW, which is obviously the Women's Rugby League competition. Give us a little background as to your experience in the league first off.
Yeah, okay. So there's been some exciting news that it got expanded to 6 teams, and it has since been postponed twice, and now it'll be postponed until early 2022. So they have earmarked the middle of January. I don't play in the NRLW, but I have covered it since 2018 for NRL.com, and now I work for SEN in Sydney, and have a very big passion for the game. And I guess what's happened to that sport has just been really disappointing. And I think communication and financial compensation are the two really big talking points in trying to move forward and improve that game.
Yeah, that's right. Look, COVID-19 has affected probably every sport on the planet, and NRL is no different. The unfortunate thing is, though, is that, the men's competition has, carried on, and the women's has been postponed, 3 times now. But with that came, some effects of players going over, being in camps, and it wasn't postponed until, after a lot of work had been put in. So maybe just explain to us sort of the communications around these postponements and why it's become such an issue.
Yeah, it's been incredibly frustrating because it got to about June and the women were playing State of Origin here in Australia, had no idea what the NRLW season looked like. No teams had named any players, and then they started asking questions because, like you mentioned, COVID's happening around the world, and every day it increases or it decreases, and we just don't know how to plan for it. But the big part was when it was announced. It was exciting, supposed to start alongside the NRL in round 23, and then it got postponed for a second time, and they were really excited to announce that it would be a standalone competition starting the week of the grand final. And so teams held off on pre-season training twice, but a lot of the women, including 8 New Zealand players, had been training and continuing to train all up during that time, only for it to then be postponed until early 2022. The big thing here is, you're right, the communication. So from the NRL head office to the playing group, so there's about 138 players that ended up being signed to 6 clubs. Just didn't hear much. There was a lot of in between. From head office, they had advisory groups, but that didn't get communicated down from the clubs to the players. And it's a headache, me even trying to explain to you how the communication worked. And that sort of says a lot in itself. There's just a lot of frustration from the playing group now because they've put so much time and effort into it and been compensated. Nothing as of yet. There are certain players who have been paid some money. The Titans have paid their players the first portion, and so have the Newcastle Knights, which 7 of your Kiwi players represent. And there's 1 New Zealander who's playing for the Gold Coast Titans, so they've received some money and back pay.
Now, obviously, that's an issue because our women are still semi-professional, so they don't have the perks of what the men do in the NRL competition. It's still in its infancy, to be fair, but in saying that too, our women, not only the New Zealand women who have travelled over, but Australian women too also have jobs. So the implications of having to take leave, having to tell their bosses that they can't come to work this week, to chase a dream, has kind of come to a head and has put a lot of these women in real sticky situations.
Yeah, absolutely. And for them, like, we talk about it as women saying it's a dream, but it shouldn't be a dream. Like, it's a reality for these women. And sure, they're semi-professional, and people say, okay, well, they're only part-time athletes. They do have full-time jobs that can support them. They might be part-time athletes, but they train full-time because they're paving the way for your daughter who might be watching them, who wants to crack it eventually and not have to go through the same thing. So I find that the revenue questions of, oh, well, the NRLW got cancelled because it doesn't bring in any money. Well, no, that's incorrect. Okay, it doesn't bring in any money, but if you invest into a business and you develop it properly, we wouldn't be in this situation.
You know, I've been living for your Twitter feeds to even hear anything about this. You've spoken to current players or to those who are affected by these postponements and whatnot, and it's just not out there. The conversations aren't being had. So, you know, one thing that really inspired us here at Sky to have this conversation with you was that if we are talking about it, we can get to that better place. So on that note, talk about the communications you've been having with players and perhaps those in the organisation as well.
Yeah, I have had a lot of communications with different parts because I also am trying to communicate with an audience on caring for these women. I mean, it's so silly to say, but if it was happening to 8 men in the NRL who were trying to get home, we wouldn't be here. It would be everywhere. And you don't want to sound like the whinging female, but I'm passionate, and so are you. And half of the population are passionate because half the population are female, and every single one of you should care about this and be invested. So my communications have been with the NRL CEO, Andrew Abdo. They have been with all 6 NRLW clubs. I have spoken to maybe at least 50 NRLW players, if not more, all from different clubs. I've spoken to the Rugby League Players Association almost daily. And then also other journalists who are trying to get information from other sources. I've spoken to a number of coaches and then also people inside the NRL who can help me get onto somebody else and find out what is going on, who is making these calls, and why is it not happening sooner.
It even seems like people think that they've put that communication through and it's just gotten lost.
That is so correct. Like, I would get a call from a coach or a player asking me, oh, do you know what's going on? And so that happens all the time still. I know that happens in most sports, but for them to be me being their speed dial going, hey, like, I don't know, do you know when it's going to start? Players should be the first to know when their competition is going to be played. They shouldn't be reaching out to a journalist saying, hey, I haven't heard anything. Have you heard anything? Like, supposed to start preseason in 4 days. That is unprofessional, and that just reeks of out of touch. Going back to my speech to the NRL, it was out of touch, and there was just no respect, and it's just not priority.
Where do players in the organisation go from here? You know, one of the biggest things that communication brings to players is trust. So, you know, I'm guessing a lot of these players won't be happy about it, may even be put off a little bit by it, especially our New Zealand players. How do we move forward from this?
Yeah, I think right now all of the women are really deflated. They're disheartened. They feel devalued. They feel like they can't win this battle and questioning whether or not they will continue to make noise just so they can have some sort of compensation. They don't know what 2022 looks like in full because it's just being put out there on a piece of paper. But to fix the situation, it's going to hopefully start next week. And that's when there's an advisory group with the male players and the female players. They're going to come together, and that's where they can have a conversation about their next collective bargaining agreement, which is the CBA, which is in line with the next broadcast rights deal. So this is to try and make sure that moving forward with the women's competition and the men's competition, there's going to be some sort of equality, a lot more than what it is now, because right now the women don't have a place in the current collective bargaining agreement.
I know here in New Zealand, women's participation in rugby league has just been growing and growing year after year. You know, the Kiwi Ferns have been around 25 years, and the Women's Warriors was obviously another big boost. We have national competitions now where our women are on show, and we're actually able to show that on television as well. It's so exciting. What is the state of women's rugby league in Australia? I'm guessing it would be probably more huge than here for sure.
The participation rates are massive. I know in New South Wales alone, the participation rates went up 24% in 3 years, which doesn't seem like a lot, but we've had over 30,000 now participate in rugby league, and it's the juniors, which is the huge growth area. There's some clubs that have grown in the last 3 years, 274% in the eastern suburbs, which is incredible because when they have the argument of, oh, you don't have the numbers of women wanting to play sport, there are certainly numbers. Like, you just have to give women the opportunity. They want to play sport. They want to have idols who are women and not just men.
Now, you touched on the potential, hopeful 2022 calendar. What does that look like, and is it realistic?
Yeah, realistic? Probably not, but the calendar is exciting. There's 2 NRLW competitions, one at the start of the year, one towards the end before the Rugby League World Cup, which is in October. But this is where it gets tricky because they'll play the NRLW competition mid-January. They'll start pre-season, finish about end of March. Then players will go back and play in their state competitions. So here we have 2 dominant state competitions in Queensland and New South Wales. And then whilst they're playing those competitions, they'll have camps for our Australian Jillaroos like they do over in New Zealand. And there'll also be All-Stars in February. There's going to be the national championships for players who want to prove that they're worthy of an NRLW call-up. And among all that, then there's State of Origin, which we have over here, Queensland, New South Wales, and that's going to be one game, despite it being named a series in the press release, which the players were not happy about. So after that State of Origin game, they then go back to their state competitions again, but then they have to prepare for second NRLW competition. There's no timeline on when that will be played, but it will be played before the Rugby League World Cup, and then the Rugby League World Cup to round out huge 2022. And they're not complaining about that many games. They're just concerned. The players are concerned because if you get injured in first NRLW competition, you have no financial support for the entire year. And that is not okay if you're trying to grow the game.
When you put it into the bigger scheme of things, sport is obviously to these players heart and soul, front row center, but life is life. And a lot of these women are mothers and have jobs. If what happens to the New Zealanders getting stuck in Australia again and there's no competition, say because of COVID, do they still get financially supported through that?
Yeah, see, and these are all things that the RLPA, so the Players Association, have to work out now with the playing group. So they're collecting all feedback at the moment from the 130 plus players and taking into consideration the New Zealanders' situation, because I don't know about the rest of Australia, but I would like to think that we want as many Kiwi women coming to Australia to play in what we think is an inclusive competition, because at the end of the day, we want the strongest competition here, which is the equivalent of the NRL, and no one should not have that opportunity just because they have to have a full-time job. So the pitch is much bigger than 2022. We need to look beyond that. It's all well and good to say we've got a huge year. Women will give up their jobs, I guarantee it, if they are financially compensated, and also if they can look beyond 2022 and know that there's going to be a bigger picture every year beyond 2022.
Yeah, that's a great point, because the competition, after a couple of years has, changed in terms of format and teams included. And, there's talks of money increases potentially for those top flight players for next year. So you are right. The inconsistency of things would be hard to kind of plan for in your future, which does usually go beyond 1 year.
Yeah, everyone goes, there was a conversation Andrew Abda and I had was, okay, 2022 looks great, but what's happening beyond that? Women can't just drop everything for a year. And you've touched on it with the family side of things as well. So if we can just keep growing, and that's why this conversation with the players next week is going to be crucial, because this collective bargaining agreement will help them in words, have what they want for the next broadcast rights deal, and that goes for 5-6 years. So they've got to make sure that they put their foot down and have a strong argument to say, we are not going to have a 6-week competition for the next 6-7 years. We want it to be that every NRL club has a women's team by the time we're in 2030 or whatever it might be. But we do know in 2023 that there will be at least, well, actually, there'll be 2 more teams that are supposed to be included in 2022 for the second NRLW competition. And then from 2023, the NRL have announced that they will be giving out more licenses, but how many they will give out is still to be determined.
Finally, Katie, before we let you get back to your coffee, it's great to know, that there's this calendar moving forward, that hopefully things will change after this players' meeting. Is there anything in those conversations about how the NRL runs during, COVID? Is there any conversations about how they can make sure that that works for women as well?
Yeah, there's nothing in there yet, but that will be front and centre on Hannah Southwell, who is the board director for women, in that conversation on Monday. So they have to take all of that into account to make sure that financially the position they're in right now never, ever happens again, because in terms of the contracts for 2022 for the first NRLW competition, the NRL are still saying that a third of the women's contracts will not be paid to the women who have already received a third of their contracts. And the top 30 that were given top-ups, they were called NRLW top-ups, they won't receive those next year, they'll receive them now. So the only financial benefit that every NRLW player is getting from missing out on playing this year is $3,500.
And thank you so much for sharing this story with Playmakers.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it, and stay safe over there.